They wore white dresses by day, and by night they tortured black men, not out of hate, but for entertainment. Subscribe, not for entertainment, but so these stories are never silenced again. The House That Smiled. Magnolia House stood at the edge of the town like it belonged there. White pillars, wide porch, lace curtains breathing softly in the southern heat. From a distance, it looked welcoming, respectable, the kind of house people trusted without thinking. That was the first lie. Every Sunday morning, the ladies of Magnolia House attended church dressed in white and pale blue, gloves on their hands, hats tilted just enough to look modest. They sang hymns about mercy and grace, their voices gentle, practiced, convincing. After church, they smiled at black families from a distance, never too close, never equal. Smiles that said, "We see you, and also we own you." No one questioned them. Why would they? They were daughters of judges, wives of landowners, sisters of men who wore badges. In this town, that was the same thing as innocence. By night the house changed. The lamps burned low, the parlor filled with perfume and cigarette smoke. Laughter echoed off polished wood floors as glasses clinked. A gramophone played something slow and romantic, music meant for dancing, not for what came next. They called themselves ladies, but what they gathered for had nothing to do with grace. "Is he ready?" one of them asked, adjusting her gloves. A man nodded from the doorway. He did not speak. He never did. The women didn't go outside to see where the men were brought from. They didn't want to know. Curiosity would have made it real, and reality was inconvenient. Tonight's guest was young. Too young, one might say, if anyone there had cared about age. His hands shook. His eyes darted around the room, looking for something, an exit, a miracle, a human face. He found none. They studied him the way one studies an animal at a fair. Does he understand why he's here? Another woman asked, sipping her drink. He will, someone replied softly. That was how it always began. Not with screams, not with blood, but with calm voices, polite curiosity, and the quiet confidence of people who knew they would never be punished. Outside, magnolia petals fell onto the ground, white and clean, covering the dirt beneath. Inside Magnolia House, the game was about to start. They always explained the rules. Not because the men deserved to, no, but because the ladies enjoyed the ritual of pretending. This was something civilized. The youngest woman stepped forward first. She was barely 20, cheeks still soft, eyes bright with curiosity rather than malice. She circled the chair where the man sat bound, her heels clicking softly against the floor. We ask questions, she said sweetly. You answer honestly. No one explained what honestly meant. That was part of the game. If you lie, another woman added, older, colder, we'll know. The man swallowed hard. His mouth was dry. He nodded once. They laughed, not loudly, not cruelly. It was the laugh someone gives when a child tries to act brave. The rules were never written, but they were always the same. You did not look them in the eyes unless told. You did not speak unless spoken to. You did not beg too soon, because begging was something they wanted to earn. They asked simple questions at first. What's your name? Where do you work? Do you have a wife? Each answer was weighed, not for truth, but for tone. Too confident, and they punished arrogance. Too quiet, and they punished disrespect. Fear was acceptable. Dignity was not. One of the women tapped ash into a silver tray. Stand up, she said. He tried. The ropes cut into his wrists. His knees trembled but held. That disappointed them. Strong, someone murmured. That's unfortunate. They disliked strength. Strength suggested resistance. Resistance meant effort, and effort ruined the illusion that this was all just fun. The first blow was never dramatic. It was light, almost casual, enough to establish order. Enough to remind him that his body no longer belonged to him. They watched closely. How he flinched. How he breathed. How long it took before his eyes lowered. This was entertainment, but it was also education. Each man taught them something new about breaking others without leaving. Marks that could be seen in daylight. Between moments of cruelty, they spoke about ordinary things. A wedding coming up. A new dress from Atlanta. The weather. The man in the chair. Became background noise to their lives. Something to pause when he cried too loudly. Something to silence when he distracted them. At one point he whispered, "Please." The room went quiet. Not angry quiet, interested quiet. "Oh," the youngest woman said softly. "He's learning." They smiled at one another. Outside, the town slept peacefully. Dogs lay curled on porches. Church bells waited for morning. Inside Magnolia House, the rules had been followed, and the game moved to its next stage. By morning, the town would notice another absence. A bed not slept in. A lunch pail still hanging by the door. A wife waiting past midnight with a fear she wouldn't name out loud. Disappearance was common enough to feel normal. That was how the town survived itself, by calling horror routine. The women of Magnolia House understood this better than anyone. They never kept a man long enough to raise suspicion. Some were released, broken in ways that could not be reported. Others were taken out back before dawn, where the ground was soft and the magnolia roots ran deep. They called those men the vanishers, not because the men vanished, but because the women did. From responsibility, from guilt, from memory. In daylight, Magnolia House returned to its performance. Windows open, curtains fluttering. The smell of baking bread drifting into the street like a lie you wanted to believe. Neighbors waved. Such kind ladies, people said. So generous. So well-mannered. No one asked why black men crossed the street when passing that house. No one questioned why mothers pulled their sons closer when the porch lights came on at dusk. Fear didn't need words. It traveled faster without them. Inside, the women kept records, not on paper, but in conversation. Remember the tall one? The quiet one? The one who wouldn't cry? They remembered faces the way collectors remember objects. Not with empathy, but with ownership. One woman, Margaret Hale, was particularly fond of remembering. She was the eldest, her voice smooth with authority. When a new girl joined the circle, Margaret taught her what mattered. "Never think of them as men," she said once, adjusting her pearls. "Think of them as moments." Moments end. The younger women listened closely. They wanted approval. They wanted to belong. Cruelty, passed gently, felt like tradition. But something had begun to shift. A pattern, barely visible. One man who was released didn't leave town. Another spoke to a preacher instead of burying his shame. A third carved a name into a tree near the river, Magnolia, and then disappeared. Stories started to move the way water moves underground. Quiet. Persistent. Impossible to stop once it finds a crack. Margaret noticed the change first. "Careless," she muttered one night, watching a younger woman hesitate. "You're getting careless." Carelessness frightened her more than morality ever could. Carelessness led to witnesses. Witnesses led to questions. And questions were dangerous things. That night, as the women prepared for another game, Margaret paused in the doorway. For the first time in years, she listened. Not to laughter, not to music, but to the silence outside, the kind that waits. And somewhere beyond Magnolia House, names were being remembered. Margaret Hale had always believed control was the same thing as safety. For years, Magnolia House ran like a well-rehearsed performance. Every laugh was timed. Every scream was silenced. Every morning erased the night before. The town cooperated, not because it was blind, but because it was comfortable. Comfort makes good fences around evil. But now small things were going wrong. A lantern left burning too late. A servant who wouldn't meet her eyes. A door that creaked when it never had before. Porcelain cracks don't shatter at once, they whisper. Margaret noticed the younger women changing first. They lingered longer after the games. Their laughter came a second too late. One of them, Clara, washed her hands until the skin cracked and bled. "You're being dramatic," Margaret told her. "Guilt is a habit. Break it early." Clara nodded, but she didn't smile. That worried Margaret. Across town, the consequences of Magnolia House were beginning to breathe. A man named Isaiah, released weeks earlier, sat in a church basement with 3 others. None of them spoke at first. Silence was safer. Silence had kept them alive. Then Isaiah said the word out loud. "Ladies." The room stiffened. He didn't explain further. He didn't have to. The way his voice folded around the word told the story. The preacher closed the door. Someone bolted it. This was how resistance began, not with weapons, but with recognition. Back at Magnolia House, the women prepared for another night. Dresses chosen carefully, hair pinned just right. Appearances mattered most when truth threatened to leak. As the man was brought in, Clara hesitated. "He's hurt," she said quietly. Margaret turned slowly. "They always are." "Yes, but nothing," Margaret snapped. "If you want mercy, go volunteer at the orphanage." The others laughed, relieved. Clara forced a smile and stepped back into place. Belonging required obedience, but the game felt different. The man didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't plead for God. He stared at the wall, lips moving silently. "What is he saying?" someone asked. Margaret leaned closer. Names. He was naming people, mothers, fathers, children. Each name landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Stop him," Margaret ordered. When he finally fell silent, the room felt colder. The gramophone crackled, needles slipping. No one moved to fix it. For the first time, Magnolia House felt old. Not elegant, not powerful, just tired. Margaret looked around at the women she had trained so carefully and saw something new in their eyes. Not excitement, not boredom, fear. And fear, once it enters a house like this, does not leave politely. Magnolia House had sounds no one talked about. At night, after the women retired to their rooms, the floorboards sighed. Pipes knocked softly like distant fingers. The walls seemed to settle and then shift again, as if remembering where weight had once been pressed too long. Margaret had lived there long enough to know every sound. But lately the house was speaking a language she didn't recognize. She woke before dawn to the faintest noise, something between a whisper and a breath. She sat up in bed, heart tight, listening. Nothing followed. Still, sleep did not return. Downstairs, Clara stood alone in the parlor, staring at the chair. She didn't remember sitting there. She only remembered washing her hands, over and over. The smell of soap still clung to her skin, but it couldn't erase the feeling that something had stayed with her. "You shouldn't be down here," Margaret said from the doorway. Clara jumped. "I thought I heard—" "Hearing things is how weakness announces itself," Margaret replied calmly. "Go back to bed." Clara hesitated. "Do you ever think—" "They're still here?" Margaret's face hardened. "Who?" "You know who." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The house seemed to lean closer, waiting. Margaret laughed softly. "Ghost stories are for children. Pain doesn't linger. It ends." But even as she said it, her voice lacked its usual certainty. The next evening they brought in another man. He was older, thin, his eyes were clouded. Not with fear, but with something deeper, acceptance. That unsettled them more than screaming ever had. When they asked him questions, he answered slowly, carefully. When they struck him, he did not react. "Is he broken?" one woman whispered. "No," the man said quietly. "Just listening." Margaret stepped forward. "Listening to what?" The man smiled, not kindly but knowingly. "To the house." The room went still. "That's enough," Margaret said sharply. "Take him away." As he was dragged out, his fingers brushed the floor. He traced something invisible in the dust, a circle closing itself. That night the wind rose suddenly. Doors rattled. Candles flickered, though no window was open. Somewhere in the house, a chair scraped across the floor on its own. One of the women screamed. Margaret shouted for calm, but her voice echoed wrong. Stretched thin by the walls, the house seemed larger than it had been before, deeper, hungrier. In the early hours, Clara packed a small bag. She didn't tell anyone goodbye. By morning, her room was empty. Margaret stood in the doorway staring at the unmade bed. Runaways were dangerous. They carried stories. Stories led to consequences. For the first time in her life, Margaret Hale felt something close to panic. Because Magnolia House was no longer just a place where things happened. It was remembering. Clara did not look back when she left Magnolia House. The sky was still dark, the kind of dark that presses down on your shoulders. She walked fast, shoes in her hand, dress damp with dew. Every sound felt louder than it should. Her breath, her footsteps, her own heartbeat arguing with her ribs. She told herself she was free. But freedom, she would learn, is not the same as escape. By sunrise, Margaret knew. Clara's room was untouched except for the absence of her things. No note, no apology, no explanation. Margaret stood very still, as if sudden movement might turn the thought into truth. "She'll talk," one of the women said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Then she won't stay gone long." Men were sent out, not policemen. Not officially, friends, cousins, men who owed favors. They searched roads, train platforms, boarding houses. They asked the right questions in the wrong ways. Meanwhile, Clara reached the river. She sat on its edge, shaking, watching the water move without caring who she was. For the first time in years, she cried, not out of fear but grief. Faces she had tried not to remember rose up, sharp and accusing. "I didn't stop it," she whispered. "I didn't stop any of it." Behind her a voice answered, "Stopping starts late." Clara turned. An older black woman stood a few steps away, basket on her arm, eyes steady. She had not approached quietly. Clara simply hadn't been listening. "They'll come for me," Clara said. "They always do." The woman studied her. "Then you best decide who you are before they arrive." By nightfall, Clara was hidden in a church cellar miles away. She spoke to men who listened without interrupting. She told them about Magnolia House. Not everything, but enough. Names were written down, times, places, patterns. Back at the house, the mood turned sharp. Margaret banned laughter. Music was silenced. The games were postponed, not out of mercy but strategy. Fear makes people sloppy. That night, Margaret dreamed. She walked through Magnolia House alone. The walls were covered in writing, names scratched deep, overlapping, endless. When she tried to turn away, the floor gave out beneath her. She woke screaming. Outside, something heavy struck the front door once. Then again. Not a knock, a warning. By morning, a body was found near the property line. Not new, old. Bones pushed up through soil by rain and roots. The town gathered. Questions were asked, carefully, cautiously, like stepping around glass. Magnolia House stood quiet behind its white pillars, watching. Margaret looked at it and understood something she had refused to believe for years. The house had never protected them. It had only waited. The bones changed everything. They lay half exposed near the edge of Magnolia House's land, pale against the dark soil, too deliberate to be ignored. Rain had done what memory could not, unearthed what was meant to stay hidden. By mid-morning, people gathered. Not close, not touching, just close enough to see. A deputy arrived late and spoke softly. As if volume alone might turn truth into accusation, he called it old remains. He suggested an animal grave. He suggested many things that required no action. But the crowd did not leave. They stared at the house. Magnolia House had always been something you didn't look at for too long. Now it demanded attention. Curtains drawn. Porch empty. No smiling ladies offering explanations. Inside, Margaret watched from the upstairs window. She had powdered her face carefully, put on her pearls. Control, she believed, could still be performed. If she stepped outside calm enough, polite enough, the world would remember its place. But something stopped her. A sound. Footsteps. Not the soft ones she knew. Not the careful pacing of servants or the measured heels of the women. These were heavier, uneven, angry. Someone was inside the house. Margaret moved slowly, every sense sharp. She reached the parlor and froze. The chair had been moved, not broken, not overturned, placed carefully in the center of the room, facing the door. On it sat a scrap of cloth, dark, frayed, unmistakable. A piece torn from a man's sleeve. One she remembered. Her breath caught. Outside, across town, Clara listened as men argued in low voices. The list of names on the table had grown longer, too long to be dismissed as coincidence. "They'll deny it," someone said. "They already are," Isaiah replied. "That's why we move now." This was no mob, no reckless rage. It was restraint sharpened into purpose. They decided who would speak, who would watch, who would remember. By evening, whispers had reached every corner of town. Magnolia House. The ladies. The bones. Margaret tried to gather the women, but two did not come. Another claimed illness. The circle was shrinking, fear pushing outward like cracks in ice. That night, someone rang the bell at Magnolia House. Once, Margaret stood in the dark hallway, heart pounding. The bell rang again, slow, deliberate. She did not answer. In the silence that followed, a voice spoke from the porch. "We know." Just 2 words. Not shouted, not threatened. Certain. Margaret slid down against the wall, breath shallow, pearls cold against her skin. For the first time, the world outside Magnolia House felt larger than the one she controlled. And the house, her house, creaked softly, as if shifting its weight, as if preparing. The bell did not ring again. That was what frightened Margaret the most. If they had been angry, they would have shouted. If they had been afraid, they would have left. But silence meant planning. It meant patience. It meant the kind of certainty she herself had relied on for years. Margaret did not sleep. She sat in her bedroom chair until dawn, dressed as if for church, listening to Magnolia House breathe. Every sound felt deliberate now. The house no longer hid its age. Wood expanded and groaned. Somewhere deep inside the walls, something tapped once, then stopped. In the morning, the town looked different. People stood closer together. Conversations paused when she passed. A woman she had known for decades did not return her greeting. The protection of politeness was thinning. At the church cellar, Clara listened as Isaiah finished reading the names aloud. Some were missing. Some were half-remembered. Some ended in question marks. But the list existed, and that alone mattered. "We take this to the county," one man said. "And when they bury it?" another asked. Isaiah folded the paper carefully. "Then we make copies." Truth once divided was harder to erase. By afternoon, 2 men arrived at Magnolia House. Not friends, not cousins, outsiders. They wore suits and carried notebooks. They did not smile. Margaret met them on the porch. "May we come in?" one asked. The question was polite. The answer, she knew, no longer mattered. Inside, they noticed everything: the locked doors, the unusual layout, the smell beneath the polish. They asked about missing men. Margaret answered calmly, rehearsed, graceful. She had survived questions before. Then one of them asked, "Why are there fresh boards over the cellar entrance?" Margaret hesitated, just long enough. That evening, as the sun set behind the magnolia trees, a crowd gathered again, not loud, not violent, watching, waiting. The investigators left with boxes. Margaret stood alone on the porch, the house looming behind her. For the first time, she felt it not as an extension of herself, but as something separate, something heavy with memory. That night, Magnolia House did not creak. It groaned. Margaret woke to a smell she recognized instantly: smoke. She ran into the hallway as a distant glow pulsed from below. The house was burning, not fast, not wild, but steady, controlled, like a deliberate act. She reached the front door. It would not open. Outside, voices murmured. Not cheering, not screaming, just present. Magnolia House burned from the inside out. By morning, only the pillars remained, blackened and hollow. No one claimed responsibility. No one needed to. Because some places are not destroyed by fire. They are released by it. Ash fell like gray snow over the field where Magnolia House had stood. By morning, people gathered, not to mourn, but to confirm. The pillars were still there, hollow and scorched, like ribs after a body had burned away. The rest was ruin. No lace, no polish, no lies. Margaret Hale was gone. Some said they saw her run into the smoke. Others claimed she had been taken away before the fire began. There was no proof either way, and in this town, uncertainty was a kind of justice. Investigators returned, slower now, more careful. Fire stripped away performance. Beneath the charred floorboards, they found what rain had not yet revealed. Chains fused to metal. Buttons melted into wood. Names carved deep enough to survive flame. Each discovery widened the silence. In the church cellar, Clara watched the men come and go. She answered questions until her voice went hoarse. She did not embellish. She did not soften. Truth, she learned, was heavy enough on its own. When they asked why she had stayed so long, she looked down. "Because it was easier to belong than to be brave," she said. No one argued. Across town, families began to speak names out loud again. At first quietly, then together. Stories overlapped. Timelines aligned. What had once been rumor now had shape. The preacher rang the church bell at noon, not for a funeral, not for a service, but as a marker. Something had ended. Yet not everyone felt relief. Some of the women who had attended Magnolia House remained. They kept their heads down. They avoided one another. At night, they dreamed of smoke-filling rooms that had no doors. One of them tried to leave town. She made it as far as the train station before collapsing, breathless, shaking. The doctor called it nerves. He prescribed rest. But rest did not help. Because the fire had not burned the truth away, it had illuminated it. Isaiah stood at the edge of the field where Magnolia House once ruled and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not victory, not peace, recognition. "This isn't the end," he said quietly. "No," Clara agreed, standing beside him. But it's the part they can't undo. Weeks later, newspapers printed small articles. Careful language, passive sentences, no outrage. Still, the words existed in ink. That mattered. Children asked questions their parents could no longer deflect. And at night, when the wind moved through the scorched magnolia roots, it carried no screams, only names. After the fire, the town learned a new kind of silence. Not the old silence, the obedient one that kept heads down and mouths shut, but a heavier silence filled with thought. People spoke less because they were listening more. To each other, to themselves. Knowing changes posture. It straightens some backs and bends others. Clara could feel it everywhere she went. Eyes followed her, not accusing, not admiring, but measuring. She had become proof that the story was real. Proof made people uncomfortable. She stayed anyway. Leaving would have felt like another disappearance. At night, she dreamed of rooms with no walls, of voices speaking without mouths. She woke each time with the same thought pressing against her ribs. Remembering is a responsibility. Isaiah worked with the preacher to collect testimonies. They wrote them carefully by hand, knowing how easily paper could be lost. Each story was dated, signed, witnessed. They did not rush. Rushed truth is easy to dismiss. Across town, consequences took quieter forms. A judge resigned for health reasons. A deputy transferred suddenly. A donation to the church was returned unopened. Nothing was announced. Nothing dramatic happened. But power shifted slightly, like furniture moved in a dark room. You only noticed when you stubbed your toe. One afternoon, Clara received a letter. No return address. Only 3 words inside. You survived, now what? She stared at the paper for a long time. That was the real question, wasn't it? Survival was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a harder chapter, one where excuses no longer worked. Meanwhile, rumors surfaced about Margaret Hale. Someone claimed to have seen her in another state, hair dyed dark, posture smaller. Someone else swore she had been buried under the house she built. No one searched very hard. Some evils are easier to live with as ghosts. The field where Magnolia House stood began to change. Grass grew unevenly. Nothing tall took root. Children avoided it without being told why. Memory, like soil, decides what it will support. Clara visited the field once alone. She stood where the parlor used to be and closed her eyes. "I'm still here," she whispered, not as an apology but a promise. The wind moved through the burned magnolia roots and did not answer. But it stayed. Time did what fire could not. It settled. Months passed, then a year, and the town learned that consequences do not always arrive shouting. Sometimes they come quietly, asking you to live differently with what you now know. The testimonies Isaiah helped gather were sent away in pieces. Copies traveled by train, by hand, by trust. Some were returned unopened. Others disappeared. A few, just enough, found desks where people read them twice. That was how reckoning worked here. Slow, resistant, unavoidable. Clara took work at the church school. She taught children their letters, but more importantly, she taught them how to ask questions without flinching. Some parents didn't like that. Others watched from doorways, uncertain but curious. One afternoon, a boy raised his hand. "Miss Clara," he asked, "why don't we go near that field?" She paused, chose her words carefully. "Because something bad lived there," she said. "And we don't pretend it didn't." The boy nodded, satisfied. Children accepted truth more easily than adults. Across town, one of the former ladies fell ill. Doctors came and went. Visitors did not. In her fever, she spoke names. Names no one wrote down anymore because they no longer needed to. Everyone knew where they came from. Her family called it madness. Isaiah called it memory refusing to be buried. At night, the town changed its habits. Porch lights stayed on longer. Doors were left unlocked in places they never had been before. Not because danger had vanished, but because fear had shifted direction. Once, Isaiah walked past the old magnolia field and saw candles placed in a rough circle. No ceremony, no leader. Just small flames holding their ground against the dark. He did not interrupt. Neither did Clara, who stood at a distance and watched until the candles burned low. She felt no peace, only clarity. Peace, she had learned, was not promised, only honesty. Letters continued to arrive at the church. Some thanked them. Some warned them to stop. One simply read, "You've made it worse." Isaiah folded that one and placed it with the others. "Worse for who?" he asked aloud. No one answered, but the town did, in its own way, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and silences and small, stubborn acts of truth. Reckoning was not an event. It was a practice. The second year after the fire brought a kind of resistance no one had named yet. It did not look like violence. It looked like fatigue. People were tired of remembering, tired of careful words, tired of the way Magnolia House still bent conversations out of shape. There were whispers now, not denying what happened, but questioning why it still mattered. That was long ago, some said. Nothing like that would happen now. Why keep reopening wounds? Clara heard it everywhere. She also heard what they didn't say. Why won't you let us forget? Forgetting, she had learned, was a luxury built on someone else's pain. One morning, the church cellar door was found ajar. Papers were missing. Not all, just enough to wound. The preacher stood very still, hands folded, eyes closed. "They knew exactly what to take," he said quietly. Isaiah nodded. "That means they're scared." Fear, when it can't destroy truth outright, tries to starve it. Clara began keeping her own copies. She hid them in places that felt almost foolish, inside hymn books, sewn into linings tucked behind loose bricks. Memory learned to camouflage itself. Across town, a man who had once laughed at the rumors began asking questions. His father's name appeared twice on the list, not as a victim, but as a witness who had done nothing. That night the man sat alone on his porch until sunrise. Reckoning had found him late, but it found him. The magnolia field changed again. Someone tried to fence it off, claiming development. The posts wouldn't stay upright. Soil collapsed. Tools broke. After a week, the workers quit. Bad ground, they said. Clara walked the perimeter one evening and felt it, an uneven pull, like the land itself resisted being smoothed over. Some places, she realized, refused improvement. They demanded acknowledgement instead. Letters arrived from outside the town. Now, journalists, scholars, people who had heard fragments and wanted more. Exposure was a risk. So was silence. Isaiah gathered the group and spoke plainly. If we don't tell it ourselves, someone else will. And they'll get it wrong. They agreed, not to dramatize, not to soften, not to turn pain into spectacle, just to tell it straight. That night, Clara dreamed of Magnolia House again. But this time, it had no walls at all, just open ground, voices carrying freely into the air. When she woke, she understood something at last. The past was not haunting them. It was asking to be carried forward, properly. The first article appeared in a small paper 2 counties away. It didn't use dramatic language. It didn't name villains with sharp edges. It simply laid out facts. A house. A pattern of disappearances. Testimonies too consistent to dismiss. The town reacted the way towns often do, when their secrets travel without permission, with anger. Outsiders don't understand us, some said. They're twisting things. They weren't here. Clara read the article twice, hands steady. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest enough to survive scrutiny. That mattered. More articles followed, then questions, then visitors. They came carefully at first, historians, reporters, quiet people with notebooks and softer voices than expected. They stood at the edge of the magnolia field and listened more than they spoke. One woman knelt and pressed her palm to the ground. "This place remembers," she said. Isaiah watched from a distance. He didn't trust attention. Attention had teeth, but he also knew this moment had been earned by too many lost names to be wasted. At a town meeting, the tension finally broke the surface. A man stood up and shouted, "Why are we being punished for something we didn't do?" The room went still. Clara answered before Isaiah could stop her. "You're not being punished," she said. "You're being asked to live with the truth. That's different." Some nodded. Others looked away. Responsibility is heavier when it isn't optional. Outside the county, the story spread faster than anyone expected. Universities requested records. Churches asked for speakers. Survivors' families reached out, some grateful, some furious that the wound had been reopened without warning. Clara answered every letter herself. "We didn't tell this story to hurt you," she wrote again and again. "We told it so it wouldn't happen quietly ever again." One night, Isaiah received a call from a distant city. They had found records, old land deeds, missing persons reports quietly closed, a name that appeared again and again in margins. Margaret Hale, not gone, not erased, just relocated. The knowledge sat between them, heavy and unresolved. "We don't chase ghosts," Isaiah said finally. "We finish what we started." The next article included a new line near the end. The women were never prosecuted. The harm, however, was real and documented. For the first time, the story stopped being rumor. It became record, and records once made are stubborn things. The record changed the air around the town. What had once been whispered now arrived in envelopes stamped with seals. Universities requested access. Churches asked for statements. A state office sent a letter written in careful language that said nothing and promised review. Review was not justice, but it was movement. Clara felt the shift most in ordinary moments. At the market, a woman she'd known all her life stopped her and said, "I didn't know how to ask before." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. It was an opening. Openings mattered. Isaiah traveled twice that year, carrying copies of testimonies and returning with names that connected to names, dates that lined up with dates. Patterns do not argue. They accumulate, and accumulation given time convinces. The magnolia field became a point of contention. Some wanted a marker. Others wanted a park. A few wanted it paved over. At the meeting, voices rose and fell until Clara stood. "It doesn't need improvement," she said. "It needs honesty." Silence followed, not agreement but attention. A proposal emerged slowly, reluctantly, a simple memorial. No statues, no speeches carved in stone, just names, as many as could be verified, and space left for the rest. The vote passed by a narrow margin. That night, Clara dreamed of writing again, names forming lines forming a path. When she woke, she understood that answering the past did not mean finishing it. It meant standing where it could see you. Elsewhere, Margaret Hale's name surfaced once more, attached to a quiet residence and a quieter life. There were calls to pursue her. There were calls to let it go. In the end, no warrant came. The truth arrived too late to punish the body, but not too late to judge the legacy. Margaret's final years, when they were spoken of at all, were spoken of without honor, no benevolence, no softening, just a fact placed where it could be seen. The memorial was built in autumn. People came without announcement. They stood, they read. Some touched the names. Some cried. Some said nothing at all and left changed in ways they did not yet recognize. Clara watched from the edge, feeling neither pride nor relief, only resolve. Isaiah stood beside her. "This won't fix it," he said. "No," she replied, "but it keeps us from lying about it." As dusk settled, the wind moved through the field, gentle now, unafraid. The ground held. The living had answered, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly enough to be remembered. Years passed, not quietly, but steadily, the way truth prefers to move once it has found a path. The town did not become better overnight. It became aware, and awareness is a slower, more demanding change. People still argued, still avoided certain conversations, still failed each other in small, familiar ways. But Magnolia House never returned. The field remained open, marked by stone and space. The memorial weathered, names softened by rain, letters darkened by touch. New names were added once, then again. The empty spaces stayed, doing the work silence used to do, but honestly this time. Children grew up knowing why the place mattered. Teachers spoke carefully but clearly. Parents answered questions they once would have dismissed. Not everyone agreed on the meaning, but no one pretended it meant nothing. Clara grew older. She stayed in the town, though leaving would have been easier. She taught, then trained others to teach. When asked why she hadn't gone somewhere new, she answered simply, "Because running gave this place its power. Staying takes it back." Isaiah did not live to see everything he hoped for, but before he died, he stood at the memorial one last time and watched a young couple read names aloud to their child. He smiled then, not because the past was healed, but because it was being carried. That was how endurance worked. Not erasure, not forgiveness demanded too early, but memory passed hand to hand. Of Margaret Hale little remained. A name in records, a footnote in studies, a warning rather than a legacy. History did not rage against her. It reduced her calmly to what she had done, which was enough. On some evenings, when the wind moved through the magnolia roots, it sounded almost like breath. Not pleading, not accusing, present. The town learned that the opposite of cruelty was not kindness alone, but witness. Someone willing to stand still and say, "This happened," without flinching or turning away. And because of that, Magnolia House finally became what it had never been before. A place where nothing could hide. The story did not end. It endured.